In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of Sterling Holdings, Julian Sterling, the company's CEO, reveled in his own success. One evening he came across Marcus Thorne, a janitor who diligently cleaned his empire, absorbed in a dog-eared law book. Julian laughed and mocked the man who was trying to study law, not knowing it would affect his life. Then, suddenly, Marcus appeared in a major land lawsuit and made statements that would change the course of the entire case. When Julian and his well-equipped team realized they were trapped, they decided to use force. Let's see how the trial will unfold. If you liked the video and have subscribed to my channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. The city of Viridia never truly slept, but its canyons of glass and steel hushed for a few hours each night. It was during this fragile quiet that Marcus Thorne found his purpose. He moved through the deserted offices of Aegis Financial Solutions like a ghost, his presence marked only by the soft thud of his mop bucket and the distant hum of the ventilation system. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the sterile glow of the recessed lighting. Desks, which during the day were buzzing hubs of commerce, now stood silent, their monitors dark screens of potential. Marcus, a man of 52 with a quiet strength that seemed to have been forged by a lifetime of hard work, knew every square foot of this place. He knew the coffee stains that were a little too stubborn, the crumbs that collected in the seams of the executive chairs, and the faint, sweet scent of success that clung to the air after the last person had left. For 3 years this was his life. The graveyard shift at a company that managed fortunes, where he earned a wage that barely managed his modest living. His days were spent in the peaceful routine of cleaning, but his nights, his true nights, were spent in a world far removed from bleach and buffing pads. Every hour, on the hour for exactly 15 minutes he would retreat to a small hidden break room, a converted storage closet, to read. He carried no digital device, no flashy tablet. His knowledge was old school, bound in heavy, thumb-worn books. The books were law manuals, thick and intimidating with their dog-eared pages and underlined passages. Marcus wasn't a student, nor a paralegal. He was a janitor who read law books. The irony wasn't lost on him. In fact, he cherished it. The contrast between his humble occupation and the complex world he was trying to comprehend was a constant, burning reminder of why he was there. The purpose was personal, born of a trauma that had left a scar deeper than any physical wound. His late wife, Maya, a brilliant artist with a spirit as vibrant as the colors on her canvas, had been the victim of a fraudulent real estate deal years ago. They had lost everything, their home, their savings, and ultimately Maya's will to live, her health deteriorating under the stress of the injustice. The legal system had failed them, a labyrinth of paperwork and legalese that had swallowed their case whole. The lawyers they hired, expensive and indifferent, had simply shrugged and moved on. The person responsible, a wealthy and influential land developer, had faced no consequences. He had walked away clean and Marcus had been left with the wreckage. The feeling of helplessness was a constant companion, a ghost that haunted his every waking moment. He had vowed in the quiet solitude of his grief that he would never feel that way again. He would understand the rules of the game so that no one could ever play him for a fool again. This was his path to redemption, to justice. He had started with simple guides, then moved on to the more complex statutes and case law. He devoured them, a hungry mind starved for knowledge. He highlighted key phrases, scribbled notes in the margins and cross-referenced cases. He wasn't just reading, he was building a fortress of understanding brick by brick. He was a man with a purpose, and that purpose was his solace. The employees of Aegis Financial Solutions were a different breed. They arrived in sleek, high-end cars, their faces an expressionless mask of ambition. They spoke in a language of stocks, bonds, and market trends. Marcus saw them come and go, a blur of expensive suits and the faint scent of designer perfume. They rarely looked at him, and when they did, their gazes slid over him as if he were part of the furniture, an invisible fixture of the office landscape. He was a non-entity, a shadow in their sunlit world. There were a few, of course, who offered a curt nod or a polite good morning, but most simply walked by, their focus fixed on their next deal, their next rung on the ladder. One evening, as he was mopping the main lobby, a young man, a junior associate by the look of his wide-eyed, nervous energy, dropped a stack of papers. They scattered across the pristine marble floor. Marcus, without a word, set his mop against the wall and knelt to help. He gathered the papers, arranging them neatly, and handed the stack back. The young man, flustered, stammered a thank you. He looked at Marcus for a moment, his eyes filled with a fleeting curiosity, before his gaze flickered away, an awkward silence hanging between them. The young man seemed to suddenly remember his place and Marcus's, and the moment passed, the unspoken chasm between them widening once more. This was the norm, a quiet reminder of the social order. Marcus didn't mind. He had long ago learned to find peace in his solitude. It was in that solitude that he could be himself, the man who was more than a janitor. His encounters with the company's CEO, Mr. Julian Sterling, were even more rare and brief. Sterling was a man of immense wealth and power, a self-made tycoon who, according to the magazine articles plastered on the walls, had started with nothing but a brilliant mind and a ruthless ambition. He was the kind of man who commanded a room just by entering it. He was always immaculately dressed, his tailored suits a perfect second skin. His hair was a silver mane, and his eyes, a piercing blue, seemed to weigh and judge everything they landed on. He walked with a swagger, his head held high, his movements precise and confident. He was the embodiment of everything Aegis Financial Solutions stood for: power, money, and an unshakable belief in its own superiority. One night, Marcus was working late, polishing the marble floors of the executive wing. He heard the sound of footsteps and saw Julian Sterling walking towards the elevators, talking on his phone, his voice a low, rumbling cadence. Sterling didn't see Marcus at first, his gaze fixed on his phone screen. As he approached the elevator, he glanced up, his eyes meeting Marcus's for a fleeting moment. There was no recognition, no acknowledgement. The man simply looked through him as if Marcus were an inconvenience, an obstacle in the way of his destination. Sterling stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut with a soft whoosh, and Marcus was alone again with his mop and his manuals. He was invisible, a silent observer in a world that didn't know he existed. But he did exist, and he was learning. He was preparing for a day he wasn't even sure would come, a day when he would no longer be a ghost but a presence. A presence that couldn't be ignored. He had a story, a purpose, and a knowledge that was growing with every passing day. He just needed the right moment to use it. Julian Sterling's world was a symphony of perfectly executed transactions. He didn't just walk into a room, he commanded it. His presence was a palpable force, a gravity well of influence and wealth. At 57, with a sharp, angular face and a head of meticulously styled silver hair, he was the living embodiment of the American dream, or at least, the version of it that was sold on the covers of business magazines. He was a self-made man, a narrative he had crafted and polished with the same precision he applied to his financial strategies. The story was simple, powerful, and utterly devoid of the brutal, cutthroat reality that lay beneath. It omitted the hostile takeovers, the leveraged buyouts that had left thousands jobless, and the small, inconvenient truths that had been buried under a mountain of legal paperwork. His office, a minimalist cathedral of glass and steel, sat on the top floor of the Aegis building. From his perch, he could see the entire city sprawling below, a vast grid of opportunity and conquest. The view was a daily affirmation of his power. He didn't look at the buildings and see homes or businesses. He saw assets, liabilities, and potential. The people who filled them were just numbers on a spreadsheet, data points in a larger algorithm of profit and loss. This detachment was not a flaw but a core tenet of his philosophy. To him, emotion was a weakness and empathy, a luxury he couldn't afford. It was this cold, calculated mindset that had elevated him from a small-time stockbroker to the head of a multi-billion-dollar empire. He was a shark in a world of minnows, and he was always hungry. His morning began with a report from his legal team. The report, a thick binder with a stark red cover, detailed the growing complexities of a recent acquisition, the land on which the new Viridia Tech Hub was to be built. It was a prime piece of real estate, strategically located, and a deal that would cement Aegis's legacy for decades to come. The only problem was the land was currently owned by a collective of small landowners, a stubborn and disorganized group of farmers and retirees who refused to sell. They were claiming an ancestral right to the land, an old and obscure legal argument that his lawyers had assured him was a non-starter. But the litigation was dragging on, creating a minor yet irritating delay. Julian flipped through the pages, his jaw tight. He hated obstacles. He saw this not as a legal challenge but as a personal affront. How dare these people, these nobodies, stand in his way? He had already planned the press conference, the ribbon-cutting ceremony. This was his project, his vision. He would not be delayed by a handful of stubborn, sentimental fools. He summoned his chief counsel, a sharp, nervous man named David Chin. Chin entered the office, his suit jacket a little too tight, his face a mask of anxious deference. The settlement offer was rejected, Chin stated, his voice barely a whisper. They're holding out for more. They've found a pro bono attorney to represent them, some old-timer who's known for taking on lost causes. Julian scoffed, a short, bitter sound. A lost cause is all they'll get. Double the offer, then double it again. If they don't take it, we'll bury them in paperwork. We'll file a motion for every damn thing. We'll drain them dry until they can't afford to get out of bed in the morning, much less pay some bleeding heart lawyer. Chin nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. And if they still refuse? Julian leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Then we'll find a way to make them regret it. There are always other ways to apply pressure. The unspoken threat hung in the air, a chilling promise of ruthlessness. That evening Julian worked late. The office was quiet, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of the day. He was reviewing some financial documents, his mind racing through numbers and projections, when he heard a faint sound from the hallway. He stepped out of his office, his movements as fluid and silent as a cat's. The sound was coming from a small, tucked-away break room near the executive kitchen. The door was ajar, and a sliver of light spilled out onto the polished floor. He pushed the door open to find a man, an older man, a man whose face he dimly recognized from the cleaning crew, sitting on a milk crate, hunched over a book. It was Marcus. He had his reading glasses perched on his nose, a pen in his hand, and a law book open on his lap. Julian's eyes narrowed. He looked from Marcus's worn overalls to the massive leather-bound book in his hands. He felt a surge of condescension, a familiar feeling he reserved for those he considered beneath him. A janitor reading a law book? The image struck him as absurd, a pathetic, almost comical display of misplaced ambition. He cleared his throat. Marcus looked up, his face a mixture of surprise and stoicism. He immediately closed the book and stood, his posture straight and respectful. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. I was just taking a quick break." Julian's gaze lingered on the book, a cynical smirk playing on his lips. He took a step into the room, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "What's that? The U.S. Code? Trying to find a loophole to get an extra 15 minutes on your break?" He gestured to the book with a flick of his wrist. "Reading law books? You think a man like you can understand that? That's not for your kind." The last words were not a whisper, but a heavy, deliberate pronouncement, thick with unspoken prejudice. Marcus's face, which had been a mask of quiet deference, tightened almost imperceptibly. He met Julian's gaze, his eyes betraying no emotion, no anger, only a deep, weary understanding. He knew what Julian meant. He had seen that look, heard that tone 1,000 times before. He was a black man in a white man's world, a janitor in a millionaire's palace, and in Julian Sterling's eyes, he was nothing more than a racial caricature, a dusty anachronism of a bygone era. "Everyone has a right to an education, sir," Marcus said, his voice quiet but steady. Julian laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed in the small space. "An education? This isn't a classroom, son. This is the real world. A world where some people make the rules and some people clean up after them." He walked out, his back straight, leaving Marcus alone with his book and his shattered dignity. He didn't think about the encounter again. It was a moment, a fleeting annoyance, nothing more. He was Julian Sterling and the world was his to conquer. He had a multi-billion-dollar deal to secure, and a handful of small landowners to crush. He had no time to spare for a lowly janitor with a foolish dream. He had no idea that the man he had just humiliated, the man whose face held the silent testament to a lifetime of injustice, would one day be the very thing standing between him and his conquest. The seeds of his downfall had just been sown in a small dusty storage closet, and he, in his arrogance, had watered them himself. The echo of Julian Sterling's dismissive laughter lingered in the small, cramped break room long after he had left. The words, "That's not for your kind," were a physical blow, a weight that settled on Marcus's shoulders and bore down on him. It wasn't the first time he had faced such prejudice, but it was perhaps the most brazen, coming from a man who held so much power. The condescension, the casual cruelty, it was all a part of the same system that had failed his wife, Maya. In that moment, Julian Sterling became more than just an arrogant boss. He became the face of the indifference and injustice that had robbed Marcus of his happiness. The humiliation didn't break him, it galvanized him. He looked at the law book, its pages a testament to his quiet resolve, and knew his purpose had just been reinforced. He would not just understand the law, he would wield it. Later that night, as Marcus was putting away his supplies, a low, frustrated voice carried from the open door of Julian Sterling's office. It was a late-night phone call, and Sterling, seemingly alone in his executive fortress, was not holding back. "I don't care how many motions we have to file, David," Sterling's voice boomed, sharp with impatience. "They're a bunch of stubborn old fools, and they're holding up a multi-billion-dollar project. I want this litigated into the ground. I want them to be so buried in legal fees they won't even be able to afford the gas to drive to the courthouse." Marcus froze, his hand on the handle of his mop bucket. He could hear Sterling pacing, the muffled thud of his expensive leather shoes on the plush carpet. "This is our land, David. We will acquire it. That whole claim about ancestral rights is a joke, a tired legal stunt. Their pro bono lawyer, what's her name? Sarah Jenkins. She's a nobody, a public defender who thinks she can take on Aegis. I want you to run her into the ground. Every single obscure legal maneuver, every delay, every motion to dismiss. Make them suffer." A cold dread began to crawl up Marcus's spine. The name of the land, the description of the legal claim, it all sounded chillingly familiar. He remembered the long nights spent poring over his wife's old legal documents, the same phrases, the same legal jargon that had been used to invalidate their claim. He had learned, through endless hours of research, that the loophole used against them was obscure, a rarely invoked statute concerning an archaic property law. He had thought it was a one-in-a-million circumstance, a cruel twist of fate. But now, it seemed Julian Sterling was planning to use the same tactic, the same ruthless strategy, to crush a new group of innocent people. He was using the very injustice Marcus had dedicated his life to understanding as a tool for his own gain. Marcus finished his work in a daze, his mind racing. He had been a passive observer for too long. He had stood by and watched his wife's spirit be broken by a system he didn't understand. He had promised himself he would never be helpless again. And here it was, the moment of truth. He could either walk away, invisible as always, or he could use the knowledge he had so painfully acquired. The decision was not a difficult one. The faces of the small landowners, the people Sterling had called fools, flashed in his mind. He saw his wife in their struggle, in their fight for what was right. He had to act. He would not let history repeat itself. The next morning after his shift, Marcus began his search. He knew the pro bono lawyer's name was Sarah Jenkins, and he knew that she was the only thing standing between Julian Sterling and his land. He started at the public library, a familiar haunt. He searched local court filings and newspaper archives. He found a small article in the community section of a local paper, detailing the plight of the landowners and mentioning their pro bono legal counsel, Sarah Jenkins, with a contact number for her office. He took a deep breath, his heart thumping in his chest, and dialed the number. The woman who answered was brisk but polite. "Ms. Jenkins' office." Marcus explained his situation, his voice steady despite his nerves. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm a janitor. I have some information regarding the Aegis Financial Solutions case. I believe I can help." There was a long pause, a moment of awkward silence. "Sir, are you a lawyer?" the woman asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "No, ma'am," he replied. "But I know the law. I've been studying it for years." The woman hesitated, then with a sigh said, "Hold on, I'll put you through to Ms. Jenkins." Sarah Jenkins was a whirlwind of motion and controlled chaos. Her office, a small, cluttered space in a nondescript downtown building, was a stark contrast to Sterling's ivory tower. Papers were stacked in precarious towers on her desk, and a half-eaten sandwich sat next to a thick legal binder. She was in her late 30s, with a tired but determined look in her eyes. She took the call, her voice weary. "My assistant said you have information about the Aegis case?" she asked, a note of disbelief in her voice. "Sir, I appreciate the call, but if this is just well, I'm very busy." "It's about the fraudulent land claim," Marcus said, cutting to the chase. The statute they're using, the one from the late 19th century regarding land patents. The one that was used to displace thousands of people for industrial development. Sarah's eyebrows shot up. Her eyes, which had been glazed over with exhaustion, were now sharp with surprise. "How do you know about that?" she asked, her voice now serious. "That's exactly what their last motion was based on. It's an incredibly obscure point of law." Marcus explained his personal history, his wife's case, and his 3 years of relentless research. He spoke of the pain, the helplessness, and his quiet promise to himself. He didn't ask for pity, just understanding. Sarah Jenkins listened, her disbelief slowly turning to astonishment. She asked him a few technical questions about the legal precedent, about specific cases he had mentioned. Marcus answered them all, citing the case numbers, the specific pages in the law books, and the details of the judgments. He was a walking encyclopedia of obscure legal history. "I'm not a lawyer, ma'am," Marcus said, "but I know this particular playbook better than anyone. I know how they operate. I know their weak spots." He knew because he had lived it. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. She looked at this man, a janitor by his own admission, and saw not an amateur but an expert. He had done the work, a lifetime's worth of it, and his knowledge was not theoretical, it was personal. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice filled with a newfound respect. "I want to see your books. I want to see your notes. Can you bring them to me?" He agreed, and a few hours later he was sitting across from her, his 3-ring binders and a few of his well-worn law books spread across her desk. As she flipped through the pages, seeing the meticulous notes, the cross-references, the highlighted sections, she felt a profound sense of awe. This was not a hobby, this was a calling. "We were fighting blind," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "But you're a map. You know their battlefield because you've already been there." Marcus nodded. "I just want to make sure no one else has to go through what my wife and I did." Sarah looked at him, at the quiet strength in his face. "Mr. Thorne," she said, a smile slowly spreading across her face. "You're not just a witness. You're our key witness. You're our secret weapon." She extended her hand across the desk. "Welcome to the team." For the first time in years, Marcus felt the weight on his shoulders lift. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a partner. He was a force to be reckoned with. And his path, which had been so long and lonely, was now leading him directly into a courtroom where he would face his former boss, Julian Sterling. The stage was set, the players in their positions, and the final act was about to begin. The courtroom was a study in contrast. On one side of the aisle sat Julian Sterling and his legal team, a formidable phalanx of dark, tailored suits and crisp, white shirts. Julian himself was the picture of unbothered power, his expression a mask of bored impatience. He leaned back in his chair, occasionally glancing at his watch as if the proceedings were an irritating delay in his otherwise busy and important day. His lead attorney, a man named Alan Cross, was a human-sized shark, all sharp lines and predatory calm. Cross had a reputation for winning, for dismantling opponents with a mix of withering condescension and razor-sharp legal maneuvering. He saw this case as a simple formality, a nuisance he was being paid handsomely to crush. On the other side was Sarah Jenkins, her small frame dwarfed by the legal binders stacked high on the table. Her suit, while professional, lacked the effortless sheen of the opposition. Next to her, a silent, steady presence, sat Marcus Thorne. He was dressed in a simple, well-ironed suit that he'd bought for his wife's funeral. It was a suit he hadn't worn since, and the weight of the moment, of everything it represented, was heavy on him. Julian's gaze swept over the opposition's table, and his eyes lingered on Marcus for a fraction of a second, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. The sight of his janitor, sitting in a courtroom as a witness against him, struck him as absurdly pathetic. The morning had been a brutal affair. Alan Cross had moved for a summary judgment, arguing that the landowner's claim was frivolous and lacked legal standing. He spoke with a smooth, practiced cadence, each word a perfectly placed blow. He had belittled their argument, calling it sentimental fiction, and a misguided interpretation of archaic land laws. The judge, a stoic woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, listened intently, her face giving nothing away. Sarah Jenkins, in her rebuttal, fought valiantly, citing precedents and historical context, but she was outmatched in sheer legal firepower. Cross, with a smug grin, had been masterful in his cross-examination of the landowners, twisting their earnest words into emotional pleas, proving that their case had no legal teeth. The case seemed to be a foregone conclusion. Then it was Sarah's turn to present her witnesses. She called an expert on land deeds, a historian, and a few other witnesses who added to the landowner's historical claim, but their testimony was circumstantial at best. The judge was beginning to look impatient, her pen poised to sign a judgment in Julian's favor. Julian leaned forward, a triumphant glint in his eyes. He had already won. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice clear and firm, "the plaintiffs would like to call their final witness to the stand, Mr. Marcus Thorne." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Julian's smirk widened into a full-blown grin. He leaned over to Alan Cross and whispered, "A cruel joke just for them, the janitor? This is it? I told you they were out of ideas." Cross let out a silent chuckle, a single sharp exhale of air from his nose. Julian turned to his legal team, shaking his head in a display of theatrical pity. The contempt was palpable. He watched as Marcus stood and walked to the stand, his stride calm and measured. Marcus took the oath, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Mr. Thorne," Sarah began, "can you state your name and profession for the court?" "Marcus Thorne," he said, looking directly at the judge. "I'm a janitor, sir." A few more muffled laughs and whispers came from the gallery, and Julian's smile grew wider. Alan Cross adjusted his tie, preparing for the easiest cross-examination of his career. This was a gift, a chance to humiliate the opposition and put the final nail in their case. "Mr. Thorne," Sarah continued, ignoring the reactions, "are you familiar with the specific statute Aegis Financial Solutions is using to invalidate the landowner's claim, specifically Section 17, subsection B of the Land Rights Act of 1888? Julian's smirk faltered for the first time. The question was too specific, too technical. How could a janitor know that? "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice even. "I am. It's an interesting piece of legislation, rarely used and often misinterpreted." A new, uneasy silence fell over the courtroom. Julian's face began to tighten. "And how are you familiar with this statute?" Sarah asked. "My late wife and I were victims of a similar land fraud years ago," Marcus explained, his voice losing none of its composure. He briefly and dispassionately explained the details of the case, the injustice, and how he had spent years studying the law to understand what had happened. He didn't speak of his grief or his motivation. He spoke only of the facts. The judge shifted in her seat, her curiosity piqued. Julian's eyes narrowed, his casual posture replaced by a rigid, tense stillness. "And in your research, have you found any other instances where this statute was used?" Sarah pressed. "Yes," Marcus said, and then he began to speak. He spoke not in generalizations but in specifics. In the case of Sunderland v. The City of Blackwood, the Supreme Court ruled in 1902 that Section 17, subsection B could not be applied if the land in question had been continuously cultivated for a period of more than 20 years by the same family. In the case of Garrison v. The Southern Railroad Company, a circuit court ruled that the statute could only be applied if the land had been used for commercial or industrial purposes for a period of 10 years prior to the claim. His words were a torrent of legal knowledge, a barrage of citations and case numbers that left the courtroom stunned. He was not just quoting from a book, he was presenting a coherent, nuanced argument. He went on to cite a dozen more cases, each one a nail in the coffin of Julian's legal strategy. The sound of Alan Cross's pen scratching furiously on a notepad was the only noise in the room. Julian, his face now a mask of incredulous rage, sat frozen in his seat. This was the same man he had seen with a mop bucket in his hands. The man he had laughed at. The man he had mocked for reading law books. "And based on your research," Sarah concluded, "is it your professional opinion that Aegis Financial Solutions' use of this statute is a gross misapplication of the law?" "It's not my professional opinion, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice quiet but echoing with authority. "It's the opinion of the Supreme Court and a dozen lower courts. The law is not on Aegis's side." The judge nodded slowly, a small, approving smile on her face. "Mr. Cross," she said, looking at Julian's stunned lawyer, "I believe you have a witness to cross-examine." Alan Cross, the great legal shark, stood up, a look of profound shock and unpreparedness on his face. He stared at Marcus, the janitor, who had just systematically dismantled his entire case with quiet, undeniable knowledge. Julian watched him, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with a simmering, dangerous fury. The game had just changed. The man he had dismissed as a piece of furniture was now the most formidable opponent he had ever faced. The courtroom's electric atmosphere was a testament to Marcus's unexpected testimony. He had turned the tide, but Julian Sterling was not a man who surrendered gracefully. The following weeks were a brutal dance of legal warfare, a new phase of the conflict known as discovery. Julian's legal team, stung by the public humiliation, redoubled their efforts. They filed motions, subpoenaed every possible document, and scheduled depositions for every witness. Their primary target, however, was Marcus. Julian, in a fit of rage after the court hearing, had made it clear. He wanted the man who had embarrassed him to be broken, publicly and permanently. The deposition was held in a sterile conference room at Alan Cross's law firm. There were no cameras, no judge, no audience. Just a court reporter, Julian, Alan Cross, Sarah Jenkins, and Marcus. For Julian, this was a private, personal arena. He sat across the table from Marcus, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He was here not as an observer but as a participant. He was a micromanager, a man who believed that if he wanted something done right, he had to do it himself. He had a stack of documents on the table in front of him, papers that he believed would expose Marcus as a fraud and a liar. Alan Cross began the questioning, his voice a low, threatening purr. He probed Marcus's past, his education, his finances, his employment history. He tried to portray Marcus as a man with a vendetta, a disgruntled janitor with a personal grudge against a successful businessman. He asked about the details of his wife's case, trying to find an inconsistency, a weakness. But Marcus, coached by Sarah, was a rock. He answered every question with calm, factual precision, his quiet demeanor more unsettling to them than any outburst would have been. "Mr. Thorne," Cross said, leaning forward, "you've stated that you've been studying law for years. Are you a certified paralegal?" "No," Marcus replied, his gaze unwavering. "Have you ever attended law school?" "No." "Have you ever passed the bar exam?" "No." Julian, watching from his seat, allowed a small, triumphant smile to form on his lips. This was the weakness. Marcus had no official credentials. He was an amateur, a hobbyist. He had a few facts and a well-rehearsed story, but he was not a professional. This was the chink in his armor. Julian gestured to Cross, a silent command. The show was over. It was his turn. Julian Sterling stood up and took the floor, his presence filling the room. He didn't use legal jargon. He used the language of power, money, and contempt. "Mr. Thorne," Julian began, his voice dripping with condescension, "you're a janitor. You clean my offices. You clean the toilets, sweep the floors, and take out the trash. That's your job, isn't it?" "It is," Marcus said, not a hint of shame in his voice. "And you have the audacity to sit here, in a room with men who have dedicated their lives to the law, and pretend you have some special knowledge of how it works?" Julian scoffed. "Do you see me trying to clean a toilet? No, because I am a professional. I am a specialist. And you, Mr. Thorne, are nothing more than a glorified cleaner." Sarah Jenkins tried to object, but Julian waved her away with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "This isn't a classroom, counselor. This is reality. We're here because of this man's foolish ambition, his misplaced sense of justice." "Justice?" He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "The only justice is that I will win, and he will go back to the mop and the broom where he belongs." Marcus, for the first time, broke his stoic facade. A slow, quiet anger began to simmer behind his eyes. He saw Julian for what he truly was, a bully. A man who used his wealth and power to intimidate and destroy anyone who got in his way. He saw the same arrogance that had dismissed his wife, the same prejudice that had belittled him. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, his voice now low and dangerous, "you think you know me? You think you know what I do and what I'm capable of. But you don't. You only see what you want to see. You see the color of my skin, you see the clothes I wear, and you see a man you can ridicule and dismiss. But the law, Mr. Sterling, is blind. It doesn't see your wealth and it doesn't see my station. It only sees the facts. And the fact is, the precedent is against you. My wife's case wasn't just a loss for her. It was a lesson for me. I learned everything I needed to know from the same legal system that you believe you can manipulate. I studied every line, every statute, every obscure case. I did it so that no one else would have to go through what she did. And now, I'm using that knowledge to stop you." Julian Sterling's face was a mask of furious disbelief. He was a man accustomed to having his words be the final ones. To be lectured by a janitor, a man he had openly mocked, was an insult he could barely comprehend. But Marcus wasn't just speaking from emotion. He was speaking from a deep, unshakable well of knowledge. He was a force to be reckoned with. He hadn't just studied the law, he had embodied it. The deposition ended on a chillingly quiet note. Julian, stunned into silence, didn't have a final word. He simply glared at Marcus, his face a silent promise of retribution. As the legal teams packed up, Julian grabbed Cross by the arm. "Find something," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "I don't care what it is. I want to know everything about this man. His finances, his family, his past. I want to know his weaknesses. I want to destroy him." The battle was no longer just about the land. It was a personal war. The millionaire boss was now a man obsessed, ready to go to any length to erase the memory of a janitor who dared to stand up to him. Julian Sterling was a man who had never learned to lose. To him, every setback was a personal affront, and Marcus Thorne's testimony was the greatest humiliation he had ever endured. The quiet dignity of the janitor, the depth of his knowledge, and the public defeat it represented had consumed Julian. He no longer cared about the land deal. This was about revenge. This was about erasing the smirk he had seen on Marcus's face, about reminding him of his place. Julian's obsession was all-encompassing, a venomous current that ran through every facet of his life. He saw Marcus everywhere, in the faces of his staff, in the reflection of his office window, in his own dreams. He called his most trusted private investigator, a former police detective with a shady reputation named Vincent Thorne. Vincent was a man who specialized in digging up dirt, the kind of dirt that people thought was buried forever. Julian didn't mince words. "I want everything on Marcus Thorne," he ordered, his voice low and tight with a simmering rage. "His finances, his past, his family, his friends. I want to know every weakness, every skeleton in his closet. And I don't care how you get the information." Vincent, a man for whom a request was just a job, simply nodded and got to work. The next few days were a blur of digital footprints, old police records, and conversations with former neighbors and coworkers. Vincent uncovered the tragedy of Marcus's wife, Maya, and the land dispute that had preceded her death. He found the details of the failed legal battle, the crushing debt, and the descent into depression that had followed. He also found something else, a small detail that would be a cruel twist of fate. A long-forgotten traffic citation for an old, unpaid parking ticket, something that had been lost in the chaos of his wife's illness and a stack of medical bills. A small, insignificant thing to anyone else. To Julian it was a weapon. Meanwhile, Marcus was a man on a mission. The court's proceedings had lit a fire under him. He and Sarah Jenkins were a formidable team, their combined knowledge and resources proving to be a challenge for even Alan Cross. Marcus had spent his years of solitary study gathering information that no one else had bothered to look for. He found a long-lost land patent, a document that proved the landowner's claim was not just a legal one, but a generational one. He also found a series of corporate emails that were a part of the original land negotiations, emails that showed Julian's team had known about the fraudulent nature of the land claim from the beginning. This was the smoking gun. This was the proof they needed. As they sat in Sarah's small office, looking at the evidence, they felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just a win. This was a complete and total victory. This wasn't just about the land. This was about justice. Sarah smiled at Marcus. "We've got him. You can't deny this. It's over." But as she spoke, an unsettling feeling crept into Marcus. He had been so focused on the legal battle that he had forgotten the man he was fighting. He had seen the rage in Julian's eyes, and he knew that Julian Sterling was not a man to be trifled with. Their victory was short-lived. The next morning, Marcus found a notice on his door. It was an eviction notice from his apartment building. The landlord, a man who had always been a good friend to him, seemed to have suddenly changed his mind. When Marcus called him, his voice was shaky. "I'm so sorry, Marcus, but I have no choice. Your lease is up, and a new company has bought the building. They want to redevelop it, and they've given me a non-negotiable offer that I can't refuse. They've also given me an incentive to get all the tenants out early. Marcus's heart sank. He knew what this was. He knew who was behind it. He hadn't just lost his home. He was being punished for daring to fight back. That was just the beginning. The next day his car, an old, reliable sedan, was towed away. The tow company, a different one than he was used to, claimed he had unpaid parking tickets and that the car was in violation of city ordinances. Marcus knew this was a lie, but when he went to the lot, he was met with a wall of bureaucracy and hostility. The car was gone and the fine was astronomical, a deliberate attempt to bleed him financially. Then came the phone calls, anonymous threats that were designed to intimidate him. The voice on the other end was always different, but the message was always the same: stop. Marcus realized Julian wasn't just fighting a legal battle. He was fighting a war of attrition. He was using his wealth to crush him, to make him give up out of sheer exhaustion. But Marcus wasn't a man who broke easily. He had faced far worse. He found a temporary place to stay and began the long process of trying to get his life back in order. He had nothing left to lose, and that, he realized, made him a truly dangerous opponent. Julian, in his arrogance, had given him a reason to fight. He had underestimated the resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. Julian, meanwhile, was delighted. He watched the reports from his private investigator with a cold, triumphant glee. He was hitting Marcus where it hurt, in his personal life, in his fragile peace. He thought that by taking away his home and his car, he was taking away his power. He thought he was winning. But he was only fueling the fire. He was only giving Marcus more reason to hate him, more reason to fight. He was so consumed by his own vengeance that he failed to see the danger he was in. He had no idea that the man he was trying to break was, in fact, getting stronger. Julian Sterling, in his hubris, was walking a tightrope, and he didn't even know it. The final act was just around the corner, and it was going to be a brutal one. Julian Sterling's actions had an effect he hadn't anticipated. He had meant to break Marcus Thorne, to make him capitulate and disappear. Instead, he had forged him into something harder and more dangerous. Marcus was no longer just fighting for a principle or for the landowners. He was fighting for his own survival, for his dignity, and for the memory of his wife. Every obstacle Julian threw at him, the eviction, the loss of his car, the threatening phone calls, only strengthened his resolve. Julian had succeeded in making this battle personal, and he was about to find out just how personal it could get. Marcus and Sarah met at a small, unassuming coffee shop, their new base of operations. The mood was somber. Sarah had been trying to fight Julian's legal maneuvers, but his team was relentless, filing motion after motion to delay the case and put Marcus and the landowners under financial duress. "He's trying to bankrupt us," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "We can't afford to fight all these motions. He's using his money to win without even going back to court." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance. "I know," he said. "He's a bully. He's always been a bully. He thinks the law is just a game for rich people." He looked at Sarah, a glint of determination in his eyes. "But we have something he doesn't." "What's that?" she asked, a flicker of hope in her expression. "The truth," Marcus said, and then he pulled out a small worn notebook from his satchel. "And a plan." He laid out a series of legal arguments he had been working on, arguments that went far beyond the Land Rights Act. He had found a loophole, a technicality so obscure that it had been overlooked by every lawyer on Julian's team. It was an old law, a piece of forgotten legislation that dealt with corporate liability in cases of fraudulent land acquisition. This law, if used correctly, wouldn't just invalidate Julian's claim, it would open him up to criminal charges. The final court date loomed. Julian, confident that he had already won, barely paid attention to the proceedings. He had his team there, and he assumed that the judge, worn down by his endless legal filings, would dismiss the case in his favor. When Sarah Jenkins stood up to make her final arguments, Julian didn't even bother to look up from his phone. "Your Honor," she said, "we have one final piece of evidence to submit. A motion to amend the complaint, based on newly discovered evidence." Alan Cross, Julian's lead attorney, stood up, a look of annoyance on his face. "Your Honor, this is a clear attempt to delay the proceedings. The plaintiffs have had ample opportunity to submit evidence." The judge, however, looked intrigued. "I'll allow it. But it had better be good, Ms. Jenkins." Sarah turned to Marcus, a silent signal passing between them. He stood up, and for the first time since the deposition, Julian Sterling's attention snapped back to him. The smirk was gone. In its place was a look of cold, calculating fury. Marcus walked to the witness stand and took his place. He didn't speak with emotion or grandiosity. He spoke with the quiet, devastating power of facts. He laid out the case not just against Aegis Financial Solutions but against Julian Sterling himself. He spoke of the fraudulent land acquisitions, the emails that had been hidden, the bribes that had been paid to officials. He cited the old law, explaining how Julian's actions in his capacity as CEO fell under its jurisdiction. He spoke of Julian's personal actions, the eviction notice, the towed car, the threats, and presented a mountain of evidence. He had recordings of the threatening phone calls. He had photographs of the landlord being paid a large sum of money. He had meticulously documented every one of Julian's vengeful actions, turning Julian's attempt to destroy him into the very evidence that would lead to his own downfall. The courtroom was silent, save for the furious whispers of Julian's legal team. Alan Cross was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. Julian, for his part, was frozen, his face a mask of utter shock and incomprehension. He had not only underestimated Marcus's intelligence, he had completely failed to grasp his quiet strength and determination. He had been so focused on winning that he had failed to see he was walking into a trap of his own making. Marcus's testimony was a legal and personal indictment, a final and devastating blow. The case was no longer just about the land. It was a case about justice, about corruption, about the arrogance of power. It was about a millionaire who thought he was above the law, and a janitor who had made the law his own. Julian had mocked Marcus's books, but it was Marcus's knowledge that was now his downfall. As Marcus finished, the judge looked at Julian Sterling, her expression a mix of pity and contempt. She had seen men like him before, men who thought they were invincible. But she had never seen one brought down by a man like Marcus. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom, "I believe the plaintiffs have made their case. The court finds in favor of the landowners, and I will be forwarding this case to the district attorney's office for a full criminal investigation." Julian Sterling's world came crashing down. The courtroom's verdict was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through the city. Julian Sterling, a man who had built his empire on the pillars of power and intimidation, was now facing the grim reality of a criminal investigation. He was stripped of his authority, his assets were frozen, and his reputation, once a source of his power, was now a public spectacle. The fall was as dramatic as his rise. He was a man accustomed to being surrounded by fawning sycophants, but now he was alone, his life's work reduced to a pile of legal documents and public scorn. The board of Aegis Financial Solutions, in a desperate attempt to distance themselves, voted to remove him as CEO. Julian, for the first time in his life, was powerless. Marcus Thorne, on the other hand, was now an unlikely hero. The news of his victory spread like wildfire. The story of the janitor who had taken on a corporate giant was a testament to the power of knowledge, quiet resilience, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The landowners were overwhelmed with gratitude. Their ancestral land was saved, and a small community's faith in the justice system was restored. Sarah Jenkins, her legal career reinvigorated, was flooded with offers from prestigious law firms. She decided to stay in her small practice, specializing in cases of corporate misconduct and defending the rights of ordinary people. One evening, weeks after the trial, Marcus received a phone call from a blocked number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," he said. "It's Julian." The voice on the other end was Julian Sterling, but it was a different voice, devoid of arrogance and dripping with defeat. "I'm calling to apologize." Marcus was silent. He had expected many things from Julian Sterling, but an apology was not one of them. "For what?" Marcus asked, his voice low and cautious. "For everything," Julian said, a tremor in his voice. "For your wife, for the way I spoke to you, for what I did to your home. For all of it. I thought I was invincible. I thought I could buy my way out of anything, that the rules didn't apply to me. I was wrong." He paused, and Marcus could hear the sound of his ragged breathing. "Your books, Marcus. I saw you reading those books every single day and I laughed. I thought it was a joke. But you were the only one who truly understood the law. You were the only one who saw the truth." "It's not about the law," Marcus said, the bitterness in his voice tempered by a weary sadness. "It's about justice. It's about how you treat people. It's about remembering that we're all human. I know that now, Julian said, his voice a whisper. I lost everything, Marcus. My company, my reputation, my freedom. And all because of my own arrogance. I have nothing left. I hope you learn from this, Marcus said, and he hung up the phone. He didn't feel any satisfaction, any triumph. He only felt a quiet sense of peace. The battle was over, the war was won, and the price of Julian Sterling's pride was his own downfall. In the end, Marcus didn't return to being a janitor. He decided to use his knowledge and his experience to help others. With the support of Sarah Jenkins, he opened a small nonprofit organization called the Justice Initiative. Their mission was to provide free legal advice and representation to people who, like his wife, were being taken advantage of by powerful corporations. He wasn't a lawyer, not in the traditional sense, but he was something far more powerful. A man who understood the law not just as a set of rules, but as a living, breathing force for good. He had found his purpose not in cleaning up messes, but in cleaning up injustices. He had finally found peace, and in doing so, he had given a voice to the voiceless, proving that with enough knowledge and an unbreakable spirit, even the smallest person can topple the mightiest of giants. Dear viewer, if you've watched up to this point, thank you for your support. I have a small request. If you enjoy my stories, you can subscribe to the channel, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts about the stories in the comments. Enjoy watching. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.